The language of biology is evolution. It's crucial to understand that evolution happens within a population. Populations evolve. Natural selection happens on the individual. So when we kill off so many organisms, they're not able to evolve and adapt to these changing environments. We have to better understand evolution and natural selection. And these discussions about DNA and heredity is a very interesting topic for a future world. So thank you, Haas. Thanks for watching. What's your opinion on DNA?
DNA does not satisfy the criterion of the concept of a gene.
Okay, so how would you define a gene then?
A gene is a unit of heredity.
Okay. Okay, so does DNA carry any genetic material?
No, there's nothing genetic about DNA.
Okay, interesting. Do you think that the like with DNA, you can express proteins from that ultimately?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So if I deliver like an organism some DNA and it expresses that DNA into a protein, we're in agreement on that, right?
DNA is mainly responsible for the encoding of proteins. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, because in molecular biology, a lot of times that's where a lot of my knowledge comes from. Where I've been working in genetics and molecular biology for like 14 years, so in the lab, and a lot of times we will introduce or transform, which is like integrating into the genome a piece of DNA. And that DNA will give and encode a special ability that organism didn't have before.
What kind of organisms do you work with?
I'm a microbiologist, so I work with bacteria and yeast and algae, and I also have experience with plants as well.
Okay, I think plants would be more interesting because it depends on the type of organism, but for some organisms, alterations to DNA can have very direct effects because the organism isn't really that complex.
I mean, I would say that the bacteria or yeast is just as evolved as we are. It's just evolved in a different way.
Yeah, it's evolved, but it's not as complex in terms of the way in which proteins actually function for the organism. The proteins have a more direct function.
Well, I mean, a lot of the DNA that we have in our bodies encodes for functions that are similar to like a bacteria. Like over 50% of our DNA is similar to a banana, for example, and that's mostly just the DNA encoding like the housekeeping functions of of us, of our organism and our genome and that kind of stuff.
So the way I see DNA is that DNA is just part of the process of the manufacturing of proteins. But it doesn't actually have any determinate effect on how these proteins are assembled together or how they actually work.
I can understand what you're talking about because I think there's post-transcriptional. It's called I'm saying these words not to give jargon, just trying to give words for people if they want to look it up later. I'm trying to not like define them as well as we go along, but it's called like post-transcriptional modification, where the RNA is made from the DNA and then it's modified, and then even after the protein is made from the RNA, then you have post-translational modifications as well, and so there, for example, in our genomes, we only have around 22,000 genes, but we have, over 100,000 different proteins. So you're right in the fact that DNA is like one starting point of it. But, I
don't even know if it's the starting point, though, because it's like a chicken or the egg problem, like where does DNA come from and how is DNA determined?
Are you talking about like the origins of life, or are you just talking about kind of like in general?
Both. I think they're both related, actually.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, have you heard of like the RNA like theory of life and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, my problem with that is that we don't find RNA world still existing, and I'm going to be very skeptical of a theory which proposes a starting point when there's no traces of that starting point in the present, because that's usually how life works, is that it's not a linear evolution of lower organisms to higher organisms. There's just branching trees of different organisms, and like, you know, like most of these like ancient organisms, in terms of their level of complexity, they still have relatives that still exist. You know, like how they say the cockroach is the oldest animal or whatever. Like, it's kind of like that thing.
I think it's going to be hard to find still existing RNA from that RNA world hypothesis, right? Because RNA is going to degrade
I'm saying
over time.
like we don't find random RNA particles just in the wild in general. They don't have to be the same ones, but we should be able to find them still in the present, and we just don't. We don't see any. I think it's just kind of a dumb idea, to be honest.
Well, I mean, there's RNA viruses, of course.
Yeah, and that's why I'm also really skeptical of this claims about heredity, because we really don't even know what viruses are, where they come from, or how they even work. Because obviously viruses are themselves undergo evolution through organisms already, right? Without those organisms, could viruses exist? We don't know. Like,
they go into like a dormant state, I guess, kind of like a tree and a seed kind of thing, where they'll go and be transmitted through that stuff.
yeah, but like, what role do they play in the evolution of organisms? We just don't know all these things.
It's
right?
actually it's a pretty big one. Actually, viruses are a really big driver of biological evolution because it kind of pushes them.
Yeah, I know. It's just, but there's just so much we don't know about how any of that works or what it even means.
Interesting. I mean, I think that science is, you're always going to have like some way of, always having a question, there's always going to be some way of figuring out.
I just have a hard time believing of a point of transition between a world of mechanical chemical interactions suddenly leaping into something like life. I think I like more the idea that the key to the anatomy of an ape is through the anatomy of man, which means something that is more advanced should teach us something that is less advanced, not the reverse. We shouldn't try to assemble something more advanced from less advanced premises or something like that. Like, we shouldn't try to ask, how did a bunch of chemicals become life? We should ask, what does life tell us about the nature of these chemicals?
I guess, do you see evolution kind of like as a ladder with like the humans on the top, or is it more of just kind of?
In a sense, actually, I do see humans on top.
Okay.
Obviously, for me, I see humans on top because humans are the only organism that inquires about the nature of its own being.
Yeah. What if I told you that, microbes are really integral for humans to do, for example, we're finding basically a gut microbiome in everyone, and that gut microbiome is really intricately involved with our immune response, and it's just like a lot of cells, man. Because if you look at if you counted all your human cells and you counted all your microbes within you and on your body, it's about 1 to 1.
Yeah,
isn't that crazy?
To me, the most advanced basically means, what does all of that mean? What does all of that culminate into? And then to me, that is basically humanity. All of that culminates into human beings.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess we are a product of the microbes, and that's within us. Like, for example, we're finding genetic differences in the microbiomes of athletes versus people that that aren't athletes. Like, they have a distinct different microbiome.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Okay.
Well, what do you mean? Like, do they have a different microbiome because they're athletes, or do they have a different microbiome from birth?
What came first, kind of thing? That's a great question, man.
Yeah.
I mean, what like I think what you're getting at is like if you just took like a non-athlete and put them, gave them those species that gave them that genetic diversity, would they then somehow
Well,
be
or
better?
like if you take a non-athlete and they become an athlete, are they gonna see a change in their microbiome?
My hypothesis would be that it would, just because that you're
Yeah,
changing your diet probably and you're exercising, so you're going to be selecting for a gut microbiome.
yeah. I think I think all that shit in the gut and plays a really mysterious but very important, but just not known part in us. I heard this story that there was like this surgery, like the transfer of fecal matter. I don't know, you know that kind of surgery people have to do.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it actually had someone who had male pattern baldness regrow their hair.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, so it's really mysterious how that works.
Yeah, there's a huge gut brain connection too that we're finding with like basically like how our microbiome does versus in its connection with our brains right now as well. So microbiology is really expanding, and we're finding it with plants as well. So the plants have yeast and bacteria. Basically there's nitrogen fixing bacteria that will bring down stuff in the atmosphere that will give the plants nitrates and stuff like that are going to be necessary for life. So we're finding more and more like a bigger role for microbes just in general. Which is interesting. I guess like how, like what would change your mind about DNA being the element of heredity in biology?
I don't think there's any room for doubt that DNA is an element of heredity because obviously it can prove paternity.
Okay.
Although I'm not actually sure if it can prove paternity when you have like a relative, like a brother or something. I actually don't know about that with certainty, but I wouldn't surprise me if it was more accurate, right? So it can prove paternity. It obviously proves ancestry, right? When you have clusters of groups. So obviously DNA is heritable and plays a role in heredity. But I don't think that only DNA can be heritable.
I mean, we are finding more and more that there's this thing, epigenetics, basically how your genome is turned on or off, and we're finding more and more that it plays a bigger role and that it can be heritable. So, for example, like they did I read a study that was like they basically subjected mice to extreme heat, and and then their offspring had that same kind of like heat. It's called heat shock proteins, or proteins that are made in order to sustain high levels of heat.
And then there's also like the whole thing about biological atavism, right? Even DNAs can be rearranged, and dormant things can like reawaken or whatever. So to me, it's like, but my problem is that this calls into question the very concept of a gene,
Well, I mean, I can understand that, I guess, because we're talking about like a parent to child, but at the same time, like, for example, we are apes, biologically, and we have, all the other mammals can make their own vitamin C for their immune system, and that's something that's really important, and that they can make their own vitamin C. But us being apes, we were eating such a high level of citrus that we basically didn't need to make vitamin C anymore. It was too expensive metabolically in order to do that. So we accumulated mutations in our vitamin C, and it's within us right now to be able to make vitamin C. But we just have that turned off because there's mutations that have basically turned off that gene. It's called a pseudogene.
But obviously, like to me, those mutations couldn't possibly just be random, you just said that you speculate or you think that it's because of our dietary change. So that would mean the mutation is non-random. So that means that our characteristics are not actually based on genes.
So you're getting into a really good point of this is the difference between evolution and natural selection. So evolution happens, the mutations that are at the basis of evolution are random. They're errors within DNA polymerase that are like 1 in a billion or whatever. But the process of natural selection is not random because basically the fitness of whatever organism is put on the backdrop of being able to survive. So a number of different ways.
But it's kind of tautological, right? Like natural selection basically means that whatever characteristics allow an organism to survive will allow. But our organisms can obviously survive in various different ways. Like this same ecology can support a diversity of different organisms, which all survive in different ways within the same climactic and broad environmental conditions, right? So to me, I don't. My problem with neo-Darwinism is that I just find it tautological. It doesn't really explain why organisms are the way they are. It just kind of gives us the tautology that if they were not like this, they wouldn't be. It gives us the tautology that everything the organism does is for the sake of its survival, right? But the key word there is actually its. So why is the thing the way it is, right? Because you take away that its part for its survival and you just say, oh, it's just the way it is because this is the only way for a thing in general to survive. Well, that's just not true. There's plenty of different organisms that survive in different ways. It's just that all of them have different conditions of survival based on what they already are.
Yeah, I guess I just see them as having niches and reproducing with one another and having a diversity in the genome, being able to actually withstand differences in the environment or other biological factors like viruses. Because we know biologically that organisms that have gone through a bottleneck period where a bunch of them have been killed off. Like, for example, like cheetahs are all basically like first cousins of one another. They're really genetically similar. You can actually take like a skin graft of any cheetah in the world and do a skin graft onto another cheetah. That's how similar they are. And we know that that's a bad thing, that the basis of those DNA changes not being there means that they're not able to survive a whole host of new problems that could arise. Would you agree with that?
Well, I actually don't know because to what extent are organisms able to actually adapt to new environments and to new conditions?
Slowly, right? So they have to have some way of like dealing with it. So this is a term called phenotype.
I actually don't know because these environmental pressures can also serve as sources of external trauma, which can induce very sudden changes, probably. Yeah. On the evolutionary timescale,
So basically, like this is something that can be selected for through evolution. So this is a term called phenotypic elasticity, where organisms will have the ability to have a host of different abilities to actually respond to environmental or biological problems. So this is where you get like different genome sizes, for example. You'll have like within the same family of organisms, they're really closely related, but now a certain one is the genome size is double, triple, 10 times as big. And it's like, well, why would that be? It's like, well, maybe that organism, hypothesis being that organism is able to survive in an environment that has changing heat or changing, virus pressures or any type of, it's called biotic, which is biological factors, and abiotic, which is the environment. So like heat, water, all that kind of stuff.
To me, I think the question boils down to something very simple.
Okay.
Is there a broader will? I don't want to say this because it sounds like voodoo or whatever, but is there a broader will to life by organisms to actually subsist that is not simply determined by their external environs? Is it possible that when there's these sudden environmental changes, life finds a way, and all of these kind of epigenetic changes can be induced. I think so. I think there has to be. I think I read somewhere that, like, mathematically, it is simply not possible for animals to have emerged from random mutations.
Yeah, I would argue it's just not random. It's like there are random mutations that happened, but at the same time, it's through natural selection that we actually get speciation in new species. So it happens. There's a funnel, kind of thing where it's pushing. The definition of evolution is the change of allele frequency over time. So you're going to have basically different mutations, different things being selected for at any given time, and it's just going to change. And it's just you change based off of the environment, biology.
The way I put it, and I wrote this down. I'm just looking for how I used to phrase this. It's basically that. Let me look it up. Okay. Yeah, the organism participates in the very nature that endangers its selection.
Can you use, what do you mean by that?
Like, the thing that endangers the selection of certain traits is something the organism itself participates in. It's not just an external environment.
Interesting. I mean, a lot of it is external, right? Because it's going to be, viruses. It's going to be it's a predator where they're in an evolutionary arms race, and they have to, like a mongoose and a viper or something. They have to, the mongoose has to have anti-venom proteins, or it's like abiotic.
Like, the organism is selected for reasons that it itself participates in.
Well, it's a niche. They're evolved in order to do something. They're not making a choice, a conscious choice.
No, there's no consciousness at all. But
okay, well, I would argue there probably is.
The specific nature of the organism, like what that organism is, it's basically a question of being, right? The form, the very form of the organism, is part of why an organism is selected for in the way that it is. It has an active role in participating in this, which is not just this kind of passive process by which organisms are determined either by DNA or environment. Like, the form of the organism matters.
Yeah, like for example, like the famous examples, Darwin's finches, right, where you're going to have like different finches that have different beak shapes that are just better at foraging for different types of seeds, right? Are they choosing the seed there, or is it just a nature of their ability to actually do it?
I'm basically trying to say that let me just put this simply. I'm basically just trying to say that since natural selection is tautological, there has to be a place for the actual organism, right? To participate in its own selection. Like, since it's tautological, all it means is that whatever characteristics of the organism help it survive, the very nature of the organism itself, it has to have a decisive role in that. Like, why is it, for example, that a tarantula is selected for in the way it is, as opposed to a pigeon, right? You can't just explain that in terms of some kind of one-size-fits-all notion of the essence of life. Each one is a unique form of life, right?
Yeah.
You can say, okay, well, because this is why the spider, it needed this in order to survive. But then the question is, why did it need to survive? Why did it have to be a spider and not like a bird or something?
Well, I mean, I'd argue the blueprint of the DNA made that tarantula a tarantula, not a spider. It's the DNA that makes that difference.
I don't think so, because it's a chicken or the egg. Why is the DNA constituted in such a way? in the first
because
place.
they breed together. Like, so for example, there's this thing called cryptic species. Cryptic species are,
I think DNA is an artifact of organisms, not the actual essence of what organisms are. I think the organism has precedence over, like, the DNA to me is a symptom of an organism, not the thing that determines why an organism is the way it is. First, an organism is the way it is. Then it's like a form of philosophical existentialism as opposed to essentialism. First, there's an existence, then there's the essence. So to me, it's the same when it comes to life. There has to be some kind of organism first, and then the organism determines its constituent parts. And then if you want to go even further in terms of like humanity, first there is like whatever you want to call it, consciousness or spirit, or whatever you want to call it. And then there is all of the material prerequisites that make it possible.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to just take this in. I've never heard this take before. This is really interesting. I mean, but the thing that's so weird though is like, if you change the DNA of an organism, right? If I insert a gene into a plant, and then all of a sudden the pollen it grows up, and then there's pollen, and then I take the pollen of that, and then I put it into the next organism, the next plant. I put it on the flower, and then I look at the genome of the seeds from that next organism. Some of them are going to have that piece of DNA that I actually inserted, and the only difference between those plants is the DNA. So there's no reason for it to make it otherwise, other than the DNA being the heredity aspect of it, right?
Yeah, but what I've read is that when it comes to these direct interventions in the DNA, there's a few common problems. One of the first, most probably common problem I've heard of is that transgenerationally, this does not last several generations. The change doesn't. And then the second problem, I guess, which is kind of related, is that the organism no longer becomes viable in the long term. Like, the change kind of like injures the organisms in some kind of way, that it tries to repair the change or something like that. Like, have you heard about this kind of repair issue before?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're doing, this happens a lot. So if you insert a gene and you don't have a selection for it, so like that, the selection is basically you're making it so, and unless it makes this gene that you inserted, it dies. And people do antibiotic resistances a lot. That's kind of like they call it a marker, where you insert the DNA and it has that ability to grow only if you have that inserted gene in there. It doesn't. And you're right in the fact that, like, if you insert a bunch of DNA that's superfluous and that it doesn't need in order to survive, then it's going to take longer to make that DNA if it's longer, if the length of the DNA is longer. So it's going to have to spend more resources. So it's going to be outcompeted by the parent strain, right? But like, for example, the Monsanto gene puts in a gene to make glyphosate. So glyphosate is and you spray it on, all of the, if you spray it on all the plants, everything that doesn't have the Monsanto gene is going to die. So in that case, it's more fit, right? Because it's actually doing better.
But Monsanto's a good example, because the GMOs are not viable, right? There has to be constant new generations of the, what do they call them again? The blueprint.
Well, I mean, this is kind of a thing. Yeah, they call it the restorer gene, basically. They knock out the restorer gene and the ability for the plants to actually make seeds. So that's a biotech kind of like thing where it's, the patent is with the plant. So now they're protecting their product, and then they're not allowing it to be made anymore. So it's
right.
Yeah, I mean that's specifically done that way in order for the farmers to have to go back and keep buying from Monsanto. I'm not talking about the business practice there. I'm just talking about the product, right? I'm talking about the ability for that corn plant to actually.
What I read is that even without that, over long term, the plants they basically degenerate. They're like no longer as potent. What is the word? They're no longer as healthy as they used to be over generations, and they kind of basically corrupt. So they need to constantly have this genetic engineering in order to maintain this. They're not viable yet.
I mean, genetically modified organisms aren't inherently less productive. They're actually, I mean, if you make them more, capable of, for example, doing photosynthesis at a higher rate or something like that, they're going to do photosynthesis at a higher rate.
I haven't seen examples of this lasting cross generationally and maintaining viability.
I mean, this is, well, genetically modified organisms are usually one or two genes. When animals breed, normally you're crossing thousands of genes, right? So I mean So if if we were just thinking about that, like what's the oddities, what's the probability of a bad thing happening when you're doing 1,000 changes versus just one? I've heard the analogy of genetically modified organisms is kind of like sending in SEAL Team 6 or something to take out like a targeted assassination versus just breeding as an ability to make a targeted productive choice, kind of like a carpet bomb where you're just kind of like taking out the entire city versus like exactly what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I understand that. But the problem with the targeted attack is there's too many unintended consequences. So the way I've read about it is that when you have a targeted attack, there's always going to be unintended consequences you couldn't account for. Whereas in the carpet bombing, all of these side effects that you weren't aiming for are part of the metabolism of the organism, and basically like part of the kind of thing that, like, it may not be what you cared about, but it's still necessary for the organism to exist.
It matters. I mean, you're right in the fact that if you're like, let's say you're doing CRISPR or some gene editing technique and you're trying to knock out or disable a particular gene, and there's a similarity in that part of the gene to other genes, you can get, it's called off-target effects, where you're knocking things out or you're disabling things accidentally. And I mean, we figure that out and whether or not that happened in a whole host of ways, but we can make it really targeted. And then at the end, we can actually see if the genome is what we think it is by just sequencing the genome. So we sequence the genome and see if there's any of those off-target effects that we've found. And if there isn't, then we can go forward.
To me, the problem with CRISPR in general is treating the symptom instead of the disease, though. Like, to me, they try to see the gene as the source of why organisms are the way they are, instead of a kind of repository of information about why it is the way it is. So trying to actually cause an organism to be a certain way, I don't think is... I think basically my view of CRISPR and genetic engineering has been basically like, it's a way to mutilate organisms. Yes, it'll change things about them, maybe in the short term, but it hasn't proven its viability in terms of being able to induce changes into organisms that allow them to still be like holistic organisms. Like, it doesn't allow them to actually the eloquence and complexity and, what do I put it, holistic way in which an organism reproduces itself isn't something that can be like accounted for by it.
Interesting. I mean, I guess I have a problem with the term like holistic. I guess that's kind of like are you just talking about like a natural way of like breeding?
I mean, like organisms, what makes an organism work, I guess is the way I put it, or
Gotcha.
live.
Okay.
Is various complicated parts working together in ways that we don't even know, right? Like there's a lot of things that we may think is useless when it comes to organisms. Like, for example, the term junk DNA, like,
Okay,
junk
yeah.
DNA supposedly doesn't do anything.
Mhm.
Although then they find that actually junk DNA does have a very important role.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like we're always discovering that, organisms are made of very complicated parts,
Hmm.
and trying to isolate one part doesn't really account for like what makes the whole thing tick. Like it's kind of like the trees instead of the forest type of thing. Like you're focusing on one part, but you don't actually know what makes the whole thing tick in the first place. It's again like, why is a spider a spider? Is it because of the gene? Well, no, because the gene is just one part of what makes a spider, right?
Yeah, I guess it's just we can sequence the genomes of different spiders, and we can see how they're hereditary. So basically, before genetics ever was like a thing, the discovery of the DNA and that kind of stuff, like we had animals set up in different groupings and different ideas, and how they're all related. And then once we have genetics, now we can actually have a way of looking back and seeing if that's all correct, right? That's called phylogenetics. So we can actually go back and see if we can group everything in the right thing, and they are similar.
Well, there's a few problems in that. So usually analyzing DNA will actually produce very accurate results in terms of ancestry and like lineage and relatability of organisms and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
We use it to test for paternity. So yes, DNA is definitely a repository of information about heredity, but it's actually not always the case. There are animals that appear very similar that we can probably like guess have to be related to each other somehow, but their DNA is just so radically different. Well, I think I've seen a case of that. Do you know what I'm talking about with this?
I mean, yeah. I mean, sometimes you look at this is one of the things where we've had to use genetics in order to see whether or not like what is actually the closest related organism to like an elephant is like actually like a really small like mammal that's not necessarily, you'd never think that would be the thing that was the most closely related to an elephant. And then going back to what I was talking about before, we even have cryptic species where they look exactly the same. Like really two organisms that look exactly the same because they evolved to do that.
Yeah.
And then we look at their genetics and they're different. And it's like, well, that's crazy. And then sure enough, we look at like the phallus or something, and the phallus is square shaped instead of triangle shaped, and that causes this ability for these species to only breed with one another, which gives them the genetic differences.
Well, but since the elephant can't even breed with that small mammal or whatever, like doesn't that probably say something about the plasticity of DNA? Like, can't DNA kind of be reshuffled in ways we didn't know before? We call them mutations, right? And we call them usually random mutations, but with atavism and so on, it seems like the driving force of life is not actually DNA. It seems like DNA takes a backseat to a more real driving force of life.
Yeah, you're talking about natural selection. There's going to be
no, because natural selection is just about the interaction between the survivability of an organism and its environment, right?
Or another predator. So it's biology or
an organism. I would consider other organisms to be part of the environment, but
okay, all right.
Yeah, but that doesn't actually take into account the form of the organism itself. It doesn't actually like recognize the organism itself as having any role.
So then how would that small mammal be related to the elephant then, in your eyes?
I think that basically it could prove that the similarity of DNA does not actually always prove relatability.
But Okay, so you're saying that those organisms aren't actually related to one another, even though the genetics says they are, and they're different because they've lived differently in different
Maybe not as
environments?
maybe obviously all mammals are related, but maybe not as much as was thought.
But only, I mean, it only takes, a couple of genetic mutations in order for, like, for example, the size difference in dogs is one gene. So you just have one gene turned on super large, so you have a bunch of growth hormone, and then you get a Great Dane, or it's turned off and you have a Chihuahua.
What gene is that?
I think it's the feline growth hormone, FGH. I'm not 100% sure on that. But it's sometimes it just takes, one thing in order to stop the, things from happening, and it can have a big difference in the outcome of the organism.
Yeah, I get that, but the thing is that I don't think DNA. I think the reason why DNA shows relatability and ancestry and stuff is not necessarily because I think DNA shows ancestry, but that's just because lineage of DNA. Let me just put it this way. Fuck, my brain is fogging. Let me put it this way.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why a father and a son share the same DNA is not because of the DNA itself. Like, there's a epigenetic form of heredity that is the reason why the DNA is itself similar.
Okay.
Which is relating to the organism itself, coming from the organism itself, not coming from the DNA.
I mean, but I mean, we can see, groups of people based off of just DNA. We don't need to see that epigenetic factors that does probably exist. There is some probably epigenetic carryover that exists, but it seems like it's an add-on versus the distinct differences. Like, so for example, there's markers in our genomes from endogenous retroviruses, ERVs, where these are viruses that actually insert into our genomes, and we can actually see that through sequencing, and we can actually sequence it and see, like, for example, if that's a unique event, then people only in that area are going to have that trait, and then you can actually more specifically even, like, see how that mutates over time.
Well, viruses are RNA forms of, I don't even know what they're called. Viruses are just viruses. They're not even organisms, right? So that's what they.
This is a good question. I mean, in microbiology, they're not considered living. I think that's what you're talking about. In my opinion, I'm against the scientific community here, and I actually do think that viruses are living. So
why is that?
Because they're a product of evolution. They can evolve. So I mean, I don't see how anything that's that can evolve that quickly and on factors of environment or biology, how that couldn't be considered living, in my opinion.
Yeah, but so I don't know if that's the best example, but the problem is that for some, even for people who are like brothers,
Mm-hmm.
some people inherit DNA that others don't, right? Like, not just DNA from parents, but I'm talking like DNA from ancestors. That's why, like, there's so many wacky stuff from 23andMe. Like, yes, DNA broadly speaking will indicate closeness of relatedness and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but I just don't think why our DNA is structured in the way it is just because of DNA itself.
What else would it be?
I think DNA has to be taken as a part of a broader system, which is the organism. and
But
that
what
is
would it
actually
be? What would be the point of heredity? That you're saying DNA and something else. So what else would be like the point of heredity? Like proteins,
I think the
RNA?
precise problem, what I reject in the first place, is a point of heredity, like a unit of heredity. That's why I reject the concept of a gene. I don't think there is a single point of heredity. I think heredity is a process that of the transmutation of characteristics from one organism to the next, or the reproduction of an organism. That's heredity, right? So that has to be taken from a broader perspective of reproduction. What is reproduction?
But I mean, even epigenetics, it's just methylation on a chromosome. It's still DNA based that we found in biology. So I'm asking is if it's not DNA and you think that there's DNA
Well,
plus something else, like what would be the other things like proteins, RNA? Like how would that?
Yeah,
What would be
yeah. I mean,
the
both
vessel?
proteins, RNA, the cytoplasm, the rest of the cell, all of these things play a part in the determination of the organism. They're not all just like, as the geneticists of Lysenko's time called them, they're not just the nutritive soil of the gene.
Okay, interesting. I guess I just don't see how, like for example, the sperm is donating things that are like the proteins and the RNA. I mean, there has to be, right? Because it's for example, the flagella is sitting there flapping, man. There's going to be definitely like it's happening. There's definitely ATP being made in order to send that thing, and that's why that's actually the reason why mitochondria, why we only inherit the mitochondria. Why the sperm doesn't donate any mitochondrial DNA to the offspring is because the flagella like gets taken off, and then all the mitochondria is from the egg. Then it's not from the.
Then, like, what makes the sperm carry what it does? It's like a chicken or the egg thing.
Well, meiosis, right? Meiosis is the process that our chromosomes are independently assorted and going through and made into daughter cells and then delivered.
But what? Yeah, but like, isn't, like, for example, some people think that the what DNA is inherited by offspring, for example, is just random, right? Do we know it's random? I don't think we do.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is independent assortment, where it's not necessarily like the chromosomes are broken into daughter cells. I think that's what you're talking about. I don't know.
I'm basically just talking about, like, is the offspring just a random combination of the DNA material of the father and mother? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's shuffled. The DNA is shuffled, and the different chromosomes, they line up. The sister chromatid line up, and then the parts are shuffled between one another.
I don't know. I just don't believe. I think we see it shuffling, but I think there's a deeper reason at hand.
But where would the proteins and the RNA come from then? Like,
well, the proteins in the RNA would have a decisive role in what DNA gets passed.
Okay. But it would be the vast majority of biological material is going to be from the egg then, because the sperm doesn't do anything. And once the flagella pops off, and it does it as soon as it enters the membrane.
Doesn't the sperm carry nuclear DNA?
Yeah, but I'm talking about like I'm trying to understand what your thought is on this, where it's like
the nuclear DNA being carried by the sperm.
Yeah,
probably isn't.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is
that comes from somewhere. That comes from somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sperm comes from somewhere.
But I'm talking about your idea where if RNA and DNA is being RNA, DNA, and proteins are all being passed, and that's all a unit of heredity, then the DNA is coming from mom and dad or XX and XY, and then all of the proteins and the RNA and all that kind of stuff, the biological material that's other than DNA, like 99% of that is all going to be from the egg. And there's basically going to be no heredity from XY. And I don't think that you believe that.
You mean that there would be no significance of paternal heredity?
According to your theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is that the bit of paternal heredity comes from the father's body, right?
Uh-huh.
Which already presumes it's kind of like the chicken or egg, like what comes first, men or women, right? And it's kind of like an ancient metaphysical, whatever, mystical thing, like the father's seed, right? And then the mother is basically like the soil or whatever, right? And the father's the idea, the mother's just the matter, right? So the basic idea would probably be that, well, and then the reason I'm bringing up that ancient shit is because like people ask, where does the idea come from? Is the idea just come from outer space or something, or just from thin air, and then that's what gives form to material reality, or does it come from somewhere, right? So, okay, to cut down the bullshit.
Yeah, I'm just a biologist. I don't know about that.
Yeah. The nuclear DNA that gets transmuted, I don't think it's completely random what determines that DNA from the father.
Okay, but my point is that the vessel, if you think about the vessel that's delivering the heredity from the father, it's not much that the sperm is carrying. It's just carrying DNA.
Carrying the nuclear DNA.
Yeah, but
that nuclear DNA is coming from, again, all this other bullshit, RNA and proteins and shit. That's what allows it to be reproduced at a cellular level.
And then the DNA is carrying that heredity from the proteins and the RNA and the cell?
Yeah, which was presumably a decisive part in the structure of the DNA.
But then you agree then that the DNA is the unit of heredity, because all of that proteins and the RNA and the cells is all passing through the DNA of the sperm then?
Well, by that criterion, the only unit of heredity would just be small sperm cells, right? That's obviously not what people mean. It wouldn't even be nuclear DNA. It would be the moment of, well, it's actually technically not true though, because as you pointed out, a great deal of heredity comes from the egg. So I don't think it would be a unit of heredity. I think what it would be is it would be a vessel of heredity, if you want to call it that, part of the process of heredity, which is the sperm cell, that's what I mean. It's what sperm is. It's the seed, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the same as what a gene is, according to Mendel.
Interesting. So the idea of the cell, the RNA, and the DNA as the unit of heredity. Put it this way. There is no unit of heredity at all. Heredity is a process of the reproduction of an organism. Organisms don't have a fixed essence. Organisms actively produce their own essence. What the essence of an organism is because of the organism. It's not the reverse. An organism isn't the way it is because of its essence. The essence is the way it is because of the organism. When you're saying essence, are you talking about something supernatural, or are you talking about natural?
Essence basically just means like the DNA, the gene, whatever you want to call it. The thing that you think is what is like the content of an organism, right? Everything has a content and a form. So scientists believe in genes in the past because they said, what is the content of an organism? What actually matters about that organism that makes it the way it is, right?
Yeah, before the discovery of DNA, it was proteins, or it was like some weird idea of what it is.
Well, they were looking in microbiology, looking at cells and looking at all this different types of microbiological structures, and then they found the double helix.
Do you
which
think
people thought was the gene, but I contest that view.
do you think that like the egg contributes more of the essence to the offspring than the sperm? Or are they equal? Because the egg's a lot bigger. The egg's huge compared to the sperm.
How would I put this? I don't know if I think the essence of what organism the child to be supposedly, right? What would be the scientific term? The offspring, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of the offspring organism, what contributes more to its essence? That's actually a fascinating point. So when the actual sperm and the egg interact, the organism itself is becoming, is emerging, right?
Okay.
Is actually being created. And at that point, it begins to actually endanger its own essence. So in terms of which one contributes more, I think that's precisely the point. Neither simply contribute to the essence. Their interaction produces the very organism that then has an essence. So, in terms of like what role they play in the creation of an organism, obviously it's like an equal. They have an equal importance. You can't have, there's no child without the birds and the bees, right? So.
I mean, but it's only
both.
equal because with DNA as the heredity like unit. Because if you're talking about size, I mean, the size of an egg is vastly bigger than the sperm. It's almost like sperm is almost nothing, and that's the reason why mitochondrial.
Hold on, but the size doesn't matter. What do you mean size?
Well, I'm thinking like I'm trying to understand your viewpoint here, and I'm trying to think like the way that the egg is contributing more than just DNA, right? It'd be like
in traditional kind of mythology, whatever, traditional human view, the mother contributes more to the kind of physical matter of a child, physical aspect, just not physical, even in terms of like, just in terms of the matter, the raw stuff. And the man contributes more to the form, the idea, right? So man contributes to the structure of that matter.
Okay, yeah, I'm just a lowly biologist. I can't speak to that. so I guess I'm more natural in my thinking and in that way, where it's just it.
So my suspicion would probably be that the mother's part of heredity plays more of a role. More of an important role in like the material aspect, whereas the nuclear DNA has more of a structuring role of the organism.
Well, there's also the mitochondrial DNA too. So you have two genomes inside you.
Yeah, but to me, the nuclear DNA from the father basically has a more structuring role.
Interesting. But mitochondria DNA can still be traced, and you agree with that, and you do think that there is some way of at least overlaying some heredity on that mitochondrial DNA mutation, right?
Wait, what's that?
I mean, the mutations of the mitochondrial genome are going to exist, and it's we can trace that back, and that's why like Ancestry and .com and 23andMe and stuff all work, because it's the ability to track those genetic changes and how they're similar with certain people that are related to one another, or that have bred together in a population wide kind of thing over time. So we can kind of surmise. Do you disagree with that?
What are you saying?
I'm wondering if you agree that the mutations of the mitochondrial genome, which is from the egg, not the sperm, if we could track those mutations over time, and that is a sign of heredity.
You can track mutations of mitochondrial DNA over time.
Yeah.
And that's a sign of heredity.
I'm wondering if what do you think about that?
What do you mean?
So
What do you mean by changes over time? Like across generations? It's kind of confusing. Like,
yeah.
let's
So
say
like,
yeah, okay. What's the point though? I mean, to me, the changes are not random.
well, but the 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 mutations can be they're from like DNA polymerase from replicating the genome of the mitochondria, and
I don't
people.
think changes in mitochondrial DNA are random.
How do DNA changes come from then? Like, what do they come about?
From the extent of my understanding is that they found that almost no DNA mutations are actually random. They're always based on pretty probabilistic pressures, and like they can actually predict. Like, they never actually hand them in a completely. They never actually happen in a random way.
I mean, you're going to have, so in a population, you're going to have of a gene, you're going to have different DNA sequences along that population that's breeding with each other. There's going to be a lot of different types of mutations, and this is called the product of this is called codon usage bias, where you can have different nucleotides, different 3-letter combinations make the same amino acid. And we like biological organisms even know this, and they'll choose a specific codon for a specific amino acid and prefer it over other ones. So we know that for a single gene, there's going to be a lot of different mutations within that population. So they're making the same gene, they're making the same protein, but the starting DNA material is going to be vastly different.
Well, doesn't that prove that the gene, so-called gene, is not the determining factor?
No, that's the product of evolution, that these organisms are able to use different DNA sequences to make the same protein, so that, like, for example, let's say there was
I don't think the reason why they're producing that protein is just because of natural selection. They're producing that. I mean, like, if the reason they're producing that protein isn't because of the gene, right? As you said, there's different codons that produce for the same protein. Then there's like this is again loose language, but there's like a deeper will for them to be the way they are at the expense of the DNA. The need for the protein comes at the expense of the DNA.
I mean, you're kind of right in that, like, let's say there's an organism that needs to survive and it needs to take out a specific protein that's being emitted as a toxic chemical that they need to take care of, right? And there's these there's enzymes that take out these other proteins. They're called proteases. And let's say that you don't have the specific one that's needed to take out that specific protein. Well, like the protease that's somewhat similar to the protease that's needed could like misfold. There could be additional mutations that happen in that part of the active site that's needed in order to take out that toxic compound. And the organisms within that population, right? The small percentage of those organisms that have accrued those mutations in that active site that we're talking about, they're going to breed more often because they're going to be able to take out that toxic compound, and then they're going to be able to evolve. So it comes down to the DNA, the ability to have those differences in the DNA in order to deal with that toxic compound. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I would argue that it would still come down to somehow like the DNA, and we see this in, like, for example, we know that through synthetic biology, the delivery of DNA, that we can turn on and off genes that exist already in the genome, and we know that we can stop the expression of certain or translation of certain proteins by taking out specific parts of the DNA. Like, if it doesn't have the ability to make it genetically, and that the gene isn't there, then we can stop it. But there is that wiggle room, kind of like what you're talking about.
Yeah, but to me, that just calls into question the concept of a gene.
Yeah, I guess like there's heredity and then DNA as like the basis of biology. So, but the ability to make the proteins and to
I don't deny DNA is what basically codes for the proteins, right?
okay.
But like, why those proteins are even needed, what makes those proteins used, how they're used, and the broader system that they're a part of is just something I don't think can be accounted for by DNA.
You're right. No, that you're right. That's so you're talking about evolution there, where it's like the changes and all that kind of stuff of DNA, and then natural selection is the screening process that those mutations go on to see what is actually successful or not, and then that
it
creates a
doesn't seem.
species.
I don't think there's enough, so to speak, room for experimentation for natural selection to be able to explain the form of the organism. Like, it's not like you can just have, you know what I mean? Like, it seems improbable. I think even mathematically, it's not possible. It's not possible for organisms to be the way they are purely because like randomly they acquired a mutation that made them survive at the expense of everyone else. You know?
I mean, I think that if you looked at the time frame of how long organisms have been around, how long life has been on Earth, and then how long the generational time is for a bacteria or a yeast. I mean, there's 2 billion years of evolution that just happened at the bacteria stage before eukaryotes even came about. You know, plants and eukaryotic life only came about 700 million years ago. I mean, it's a very recent.
Yeah, I just to me the basic problem is that, yeah, I understand the time scale is like very, very long, but it's just natural selection itself being able to have and explain. Again, it's to me, it's tautological. Like, it's not necessarily that it's wrong, just that for it to be random just doesn't seem possible to me.
But it's not random. Natural selection isn't random. That's the thing, is that your random
Well,
mutations
the idea is
that
like
created
there's random mutations in
Yeah.
DNA, like an infinite possibility of different mutations, and that the ones that work, so to speak, according to environmental conditions, are selected for.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's enough room for infinite possibilities. I think the reason why this selection happens is because of the organism too. It's not just because, like, you know what I mean by that? I don't. I just don't.
But you're not. We're not like so. So the mutations that happen, it's not like, you know, I'm gonna have the mutations that, you know, there's no amount of mutations that my kid is gonna become a fish. You know what I mean? It's not gonna like there's that amount of mutations like isn't possible. It's gonna be like just slight changes that happen. You know, maybe. You know, like, you know, the birth defects is what we normally call it, but there's a lot of different variations that happen, you know, even in our own genome.
Yeah, I know, but in order for those variations to actually be decisive and selected for by the environment, there has to either be an environmental change, you know, or it just doesn't seem very plausible to me.
Interesting. Are there any scientists like now that you think are really following like what you're talking about, like a paper or any way, any like experiments that you think that are really like showing what you're talking about?
Before I answer why,
I'm just curious. Like I like to read primary sources and science journals and stuff like that. So I'm just curious. There is like a you know, epigenetics like research going on. So I'm curious, like just curious about that. Do you think that, yeah, that just a personal interest? I don't.
Um. So there is. He's He's actually a. Well, he. I don't know his actual name because he uses a pseudonym, but uh, he does go by the name Pesto Mime. You ever heard of that?
No, I haven't. Is there a platform that he's talking on or posting on?
I think he contributes to the Nature Journal.
Okay. I found like a
Also blogs and stuff too.
okay. Okay, interesting. Okay, cool, man. Well, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the discussion. So, hopefully, I've been like fair to you. And if you have any questions,
Yeah, I think you've been fair.
Cool, man. Cool. Like, if you have any questions on biology or science or anything, I'd love to answer them. If you have any questions in the future, so.
All right. See you later.
Sounds good, man. See you.